More than 40,000 people are under evacuation orders in Southern California right now, and the fire that drove them out started when a tractor hit a rock. That is the official account. One spark, off one stone, on one ordinary Monday, and within 48 hours, a large piece of a city was empty. In this report, we are going to explain exactly how an ignition that small did damage that large, why a second California fire this week proves it was not a fluke, and what the terrifying truth behind both of them means for the rest of the country. Here is the fact this entire report is built around. A wildfire in Southern California has now forced more than 40,000 people out of their homes, and it started when a tractor hit a rock. That is not a simplification. That is the official account. At roughly 17 minutes past 10 in the morning on Monday, in the hills south of Simi Valley in Ventura County, a person was operating a tractor on agricultural land. The machine struck a rock buried in the dry ground. Steel hit stone and the contact threw a spark. That spark landed in dry brush. Investigators are still formally calling the cause undetermined, but the tractor and rock account is the working explanation, and it is the explanation everyone is operating on. They named the resulting fire the Sandy Fire. And in roughly 48 hours, that single spark grew into an incident that has burned close to 1,700 acres, destroyed at least one home, and emptied a large piece of a city of more than 125,000 people. You need to stop and register how strange that is. We expect disasters to have disasters behind them. A catastrophe is supposed to come from a catastrophic cause. An earthquake, an explosion, a storm of historic violence. Instead, the cause here is almost nothing. A spark off a rock is one of the lowest energy ignition events there is. It is so minor that on almost any other day, in almost any other year, it would have meant nothing. It would have scorched a patch of dirt the size of a coin and gone out before anyone noticed. It did not go out. And the reason it did not go out is the terrifying truth this video is going to lay out for you. The Sandy Fire is not really a story about a tractor. It is a story about what has happened to the ground itself. Consider the proportions for a second, because they are the whole problem. The energy in that spark was tiny, a flicker of friction, gone in a fraction of a second. The energy released by the fire it started, the destruction, the labor of nearly 900 firefighters, the upheaval of 40,000 lives, all of it is larger than the cause by a margin so enormous, the comparison almost stops making sense. Cause and effect are not in the same universe of scale here, and that mismatch is not a quirk of this one fire. It is the defining feature of wildfire in a drought, and it should worry you because it means the usual relationship between how careful you are and how safe you are is broken. In a normal year, a small mistake produces a small consequence. In a drought year, a small mistake, or no mistake at all, can produce a catastrophe. Let's go through what actually happened, because the speed of it is the first piece of evidence. The spark landed mid-morning on Monday. The fire was reported almost immediately. This was not a blaze that smoldered unseen in some roadless canyon. It started in clear daylight above a major suburb, and crews responded fast. By every measure of the human response, this was quick and competent. It did not matter enough. By Monday afternoon, the fire was wind-driven, pushed by gusts topping 30 miles an hour. 30 miles an hour is not a hurricane. It is a breezy afternoon. But put an ordinary breeze behind a fire that has found receptive fuel, and it becomes an engine. It bends the flames forward, it feeds the fire oxygen, and it throws burning embers ahead of the fire to start new ignitions downwind. By Tuesday morning, the Sandy Fire had consumed more than 2 square miles of dry brush. Then the winds calmed overnight, and that is when crews finally started to make progress. Containment, which had been stuck at 5%, climbed to roughly 15% by yesterday. Around 869 firefighting personnel were assigned to the incident, pulled in from agencies across Southern California, working around the clock with hand crews, bulldozers, helicopters, and air tankers. But notice what it took. The single biggest factor in crews getting a grip on this fire was not something they did, it was the wind dying down. And the moment the wind shifted again, even briefly, a spot fire ignited outside the main perimeter, and forced officials to send in more than 100 additional firefighters. One ember, 100 more people. And then there's the number that matters most. The headline that went around the country said more than 17,000 people were under evacuation orders. That number is already wrong. As the fire grew through Tuesday and into yesterday, the evacuation footprint expanded again and again. The current official figure is roughly 43,700 residents under mandatory evacuation orders, with several hundred more under warnings. The number of people driven from their homes by this fire roughly tripled in about a day. The human cost grew faster than the headlines could keep up with it, and it is worth being clear about what is inside that number, because 43,700 is easy to let slide past as an abstraction. It is not an abstraction. It is that many people who, in the middle of a Monday or a Tuesday, looked up, saw the smoke, checked their phones, and were told to go. It is the awful arithmetic of evacuation, the few minutes to decide what fits in a car, the documents, the medications, the pets, the photographs if there is time, and often there is not. It is the elderly who cannot move fast, families with small children, people without a vehicle of their own. An evacuation order is not a statistic. It is 40,000 small emergencies happening at once, and every one of them traces back to a spark off a rock. The fire also burned close to several schools and to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, which is part of why the rest of the country looked up and paid attention. Here is where we get to the truth of it. The tractor is not the cause of this disaster. The tractor is the trigger. And those are two different things. Think of a building filled floor to ceiling with explosive vapor. Someone flips a light switch, the switch sparks, and the building explodes. What caused the explosion? Technically, the switch. But you understand instinctively that this is a bad answer. The switch did almost nothing. It released energy that something else had already loaded into the room. The real cause is whatever filled the building with vapor. The Sandy fire is the light switch. So the real question is, what filled the hills of Ventura County with vapor? What loaded that landscape so completely that a tractor spark could empty a city? The answer is a drought, and not an ordinary one. The opening months of 2026 were the driest start to a year the United States has recorded in roughly 131 years of continuous measurement. Not one of the driest. The driest, and it is not a local problem. Drought conditions currently stretch across more than 40% of the contiguous United States. To understand why that turns a spark into a catastrophe, you need one simple idea, and it is the key to this whole story. Any fire needs three things at the same time: heat, oxygen, and fuel. Firefighters call this the fire triangle. Remove any one of the three and the fire cannot exist. In a normal, well-watered landscape, the hardest leg to satisfy, the leg doing the protective work, is fuel. And that sounds wrong because the brush is right there covering every hillside. But living vegetation is mostly water, and water is the enemy of fire. Before a flame can ignite a green plant, it has to spend its energy boiling off all the moisture inside that plant first. A spark landing on a green, moisture-rich hillside simply does not carry enough energy to pay that cost. It dies. In a normal year, the landscape is fireproof by its own water. Fire scientists measure this. They track something called live fuel moisture. How much water is in living plants relative to their dry weight? When that number is high, vegetation resists fire. When it is low, vegetation stops behaving like a plant and starts behaving like cured kindling. And this is the terrifying truth at the center of this report. A severe drought does one specific thing to the fire triangle. It removes the fuel limitation. When the drought drains the moisture out of the vegetation, the landscape stops resisting. The fuel leg of the triangle, normally the protective one, becomes trivially easy to satisfy. The hills are no longer covered in wet, fire-resistant brush. They are covered in fuel that is completely ready to burn, preloaded, waiting. And once the fuel is in that state, the ignition source no longer has to be powerful. It no longer has to pay the drying cost because the drought already paid it. A spark off a rock now carries enough energy. So does a signal flare. So does a vehicle exhaust over dry grass, a dragging trailer chain, a power tool, a discarded cigarette. In a drought-loaded landscape, every one of those carries enough energy, and none of them would have in a wet year. That is why the tractor is interchangeable. If it had not been a tractor on Monday, it would have been something else on Tuesday or yesterday or any day the conditions held. The drought did not arrange for a specific spark. It arranged for it so that any spark would do. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. None of this is a mystery. The fire triangle is old, settled textbook science. It is taught to every wildland firefighter on their first day. Fuel moisture is measured and forecast routinely. The mechanism that turned a tractor spark into a 40,000-person evacuation is completely, unanimously understood. The frightening thing is not that the science is uncertain. It is that the science is crystal clear, and what it says is that a country sitting in a record-tier drought has quietly lost the natural safety margin it used to have against careless, accidental, ordinary sparks. That margin was never something we built or maintained. It was a free gift from a wetter landscape. And right now, across a huge fraction of the country, that gift has been withdrawn. The drought does not only make fires start more easily, it makes them spread faster once they start. And that is the other half of what we watched in Simi Valley. A fire's rate of spread depends on fuel moisture, on how continuous the fuel is, on wind, on temperature and humidity, and on slope. A drought attacks nearly all of those at once. It drains the fuel moisture. It dries out the green, damp gaps and low spots that would normally act as natural fire breaks, so the fire that should have stopped at a wet draw now sails straight across it. And drought tends to come packaged with hotter, drier air, which primes the fuel even further. Add the terrain south of Simi Valley, which is steep. Fire moves faster uphill because the flames lean in toward the slope above them and preheat the fuel before the fire even arrives. Steep ground also makes it harder and more dangerous to get crews and bulldozers in, which forces a heavier reliance on aircraft. So, in a drought year, a fire is not just easier to start. Once lit, it runs faster, jumps the brakes that used to stop it, and reaches more ground before any crew can cut a line around it. There is also a sobering limit hiding in that fact. We tend to assume more firefighters and more aircraft can stop more fires, and capacity does matter. But what actually turned the corner on the Sandy fire was not a surge of resources. It was the wind dropping overnight. When the fuel bed is loaded badly enough and the wind is up, there's a point past which throwing more crews at a fire stops scaling because the fire is simply moving faster than any line can be cut. Firefighting operates downstream of the fuel state. You cannot staff your way out of a landscape turned into kindling. That is exactly why the Sandy fire did its worst damage in its first 24 hours. And it gets worse because that pattern is not unique to this fire. Here is the development that turns the Sandy fire from an incident into a warning. While crews fought the Sandy fire on the mainland, a second larger fire was burning offshore. On Santa Rosa Island, part of Channel Islands National Park, about 50 miles off the coast. That fire started in a completely different way. A 67-year-old man was sailing. His boat crashed onto the rocks off the island and was wrecked, leaving him stranded. So he did exactly what a stranded mariner is supposed to do. He set off distress flares to signal SOS. The U.S. Coast Guard rescued him the next morning. As a survival story, it ended well. But according to the Coast Guard, those distress flares, fired in a justified textbook-correct call for rescue, are the suspected source of the fire. And that fire did not stay small. By Tuesday, it had burned around 16,600 acres, roughly 23 square miles, about 10 times the size of the Sandy fire. It destroyed at least 2 historic structures and forced the evacuation of 11 National Park Service employees. Now put the 2 fires side by side. One was a tractor striking a rock on a mainland hillside. The other was a shipwrecked sailor's distress flare on a remote island 50 miles out to sea. There is no connection between them. They are about as unrelated as 2 ignitions could possibly be. And yet both produced major fires in the same week, in the same region. That is the proof. If the ignition source were the real cause, 2 completely different ignition sources should not produce the same outcome. They did. Which means the thing that determined the outcome was not the spark. It was the one thing the 2 fires share. Both sparks fell onto a drought-loaded landscape. And the Santa Rosa Island fire makes it even starker, because that sailor did nothing wrong. He did the correct thing. We have reached a point where even the correct emergency action can ignite a major wildfire, because the drought has made the landscape that unforgiving. This is what fire scientists actually mean when they assess a region's fire risk. They are not really predicting ignitions. Ignitions are a given. In a populated landscape, there will always be sparks. Tractors will hit rocks, boats will wreck, and stranded sailors will fire their flares. Vehicles run hot, power lines sag, equipment throws sparks. Those events are a constant. What is not constant is whether the landscape converts those inevitable sparks into disasters. That conversion rate is the real variable. In a wet year, it is low, and almost every spark dies. In a record drought year, it climbs steeply. And in the spring of 2026, in Southern California, it is dangerously, historically high. The background noise of ordinary accidents has not changed. What has changed is that the landscape now amplifies that noise into catastrophe. The drought behind both fires is worth a closer look because its size is the size of the danger. For Southern California specifically, fire behavior forecasters describe the setup directly. There is an unusually heavy load of grass. A thick crop grew earlier in the season and then the moisture shut off. And now all that grass is curing into dead, dried-out fuel. Cured dead grass is the most ignitable material in any landscape. On top of that, the marine layer, the bank of cool, moist ocean air that normally keeps coastal California damp into early summer, is weakening earlier than it should. And the snowpack that normally feeds water into the soil through spring never fully arrived, so fine fuels are drying out faster and earlier than in a normal year. Every one of those is a different face of the same fact. The drought has drained the water out of the fuel, and forecasters are blunt about the result. The risk of large fires has risen across multiple fuel types, grass, brush, and timber alike. This is also why the timing matters. This is mid-May. The historically dangerous window for major Southern California wildfires is late summer and fall, when fuels are most cured. A fire forcing 40,000 evacuations in May is a fire happening out of season, which is exactly what you would expect if the drought has shifted the entire calendar of danger earlier. There's a theory circulating online that deserves a direct answer because you have probably seen it. The theory says it is suspicious, too convenient, that 2 large fires erupted in 1 week from 2 such harmless-sounding accidents. A related claim says the 17,000 evacuation figure was a deliberate undercount. Both fail against the data. Accidental human ignitions are, by a wide margin, the most common way wildfires start in the United States. In any given week, in a populated landscape, there are not 2 potential accidental sparks. There are dozens. In a wet year, almost all of them die harmlessly. In a record drought year, a meaningful fraction catch and run. So multiple accidental fires clustered in 1 week is not the fingerprint of a conspiracy. It is the statistically predictable result of a primed landscape. As for the evacuation number, it changed because the fire grew and officials responsibly expanded the orders. That is what a developing emergency looks like, not a cover-up. And here is the part worth sitting with. The true explanation is more alarming than the conspiracy, not less. A conspiracy could be stopped by catching someone. A drought cannot. There is no hidden hand here. There is a documented measured condition stripping the safety margin off more than 40% of the country, and it is not going anywhere when the news cycle moves on. So where does this go from here? The drought is still in place. It did not end when the Sandy Fire's containment lines went in. The seasonal outlook for California calls for above normal heat and below normal rain through the spring, which means more drying, more curing, a fuel bed that gets more receptive, not less. And the projections for the full 2026 California fire season are stark. Forecasters expect something on the order of 500,000 to 750,000 acres burned across the state this year, across an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 individual wildfires. And they warn that as the season deepens, conditions will increasingly favor fires that ignite more readily, spread faster, and resist containment. Read the Sandy Fire against that forecast, and its real nature comes into focus. The Sandy Fire is not the season. It is the season clearing its throat, one early contained survivable sample arriving in May before the traditional fire season has even begun. Here is the takeaway, and it is the terrifying truth the title promised you. The Sandy Fire was a warning delivered quietly. It burned under 2,000 acres. The winds calmed when crews needed them to. The fire was caught fast in daylight. 1 home was lost, and as of the latest reporting, no lives. By the brutal standards of California wildfire, that is a merciful outcome. This was the failure mode showing us its mildest face. But strip it down to the mechanism, and what it tells us should stop you cold. A tractor hit a rock and emptied a city. A man fired a rescue flare and burned a national park. Neither of them did anything wrong. The drought has quietly removed the invisible margin of safety that used to sit between an ordinary accident and a full-scale disaster, and it has removed it across more than 40% of the United States. The terrifying truth is not beware of tractors. It is that the cost of ordinary carelessness, and even of ordinary correct behavior, has been multiplied everywhere the land is dry. We will be tracking this as it develops. The containment numbers, the evacuation orders, and whether the drought that made all of this possible shows any sign of breaking. Because until it does, the next spark is already out there. The only question is where it lands.